The clock struck 3:17 Uhr nachts when Detective Marla Graves stepped into the abandoned cabin deep in the Blackwood Forest. The putrid stench hit her like a punch, but she didn't flinch. She had smelled death before. This, however, was something else, something colder, older, methodical. Her flashlight flickered across the room, casting shadows on walls lined with dozens of mannequin-like figures, until she realized they weren't mannequins at all. They were the missing. Preserved. Posed. Each victim displayed like a twisted art piece, their final expressions frozen in silent agony. Back at the city, in a dark, soundproofed room filled with flickering monitors, he saw it happen. The cabin. The police. The horror dawning on their faces. The game was over. For 10 years, the man known only as the composer had orchestrated symphonies of fear and death across 4 states. He believed himself untouchable, his crimes masterpieces. Each victim chosen with care, each scene meticulously arranged. But now, his final gallery had been discovered. His secrets laid bare. His name, soon to follow. And yet, as the sirens wailed in the distance, growing closer to his hideout, he didn't panic. He didn't run. He smiled. This, too, was part of the composition. Because what the police didn't know, what no one knew, was that the final act hadn't been written yet. And in that final act, they would become part of the collection. The composer stood, calmly adjusting the cuffs of his black coat. He walked to the mirror on the far wall of his hideout, watching his own reflection with a curiosity bordering on admiration. "They found it," he whispered. "At last." He turned, revealing a series of newspaper clippings and photographs pinned in a meticulous grid. Faces of detectives. Forensic experts. Journalists. All key players in the game. All part of the orchestra. Marla Graves' photo was dead center, a red thread connecting her to every other player. She had been the most persistent, the most clever. He had watched her for months, studied her thoughts through her case reports, her movements through surveillance. She was perfect. Back in the forest, Marla's voice crackled over the radio. "We've got at least 22 bodies, refrigerated, staged. We're sealing off the perimeter. He's been watching us. I can feel it." Her partner, Daniels, scanned the trees nervously. "You think he's still close?" "No," she said, narrowing her eyes. "He's already moved on. This was never the end. It's a message." She turned toward the largest victim display, a woman in a ballet pose, hands lifted mid-performance. On the wall behind her, carved into the wood with chilling precision, were the words, "A finale is only the beginning of silence." Meanwhile, in a quiet corner of the city, a piano played softly in an empty concert hall. Hidden speakers projected the eerie melody through the building. On stage, a single envelope rested on the conductor's stand, addressed in elegant calligraphy. To Detective Graves, Movement 2, Requiem. Inside, a single sheet of music. Blank. Except for one line at the bottom. "Let's see if you can keep up, maestro." Detective Marla Graves sat alone in her dimly lit apartment, the envelope resting unopened in front of her. She'd had it scanned for toxins, prints, even microdots. Nothing. Clean. Too clean. But she knew it wasn't empty. It was bait. She finally opened it with a gloved hand. The single blank sheet of music felt heavier than it should. That line at the bottom still echoed in her head. "Let's see if you can keep up, maestro." Her eyes narrowed. Maestro? She hadn't told anyone, not even Daniels, that she had once studied classical composition before joining the force. Before her sister was taken. Before her sister's body turned up in the first batch of the composer's victims. This wasn't just a game anymore. It was personal. Had been for years. Marla unfolded a second note hidden behind the sheet music. A GPS-Koordinate. Remote. Mountainous-Terrain absteht. Just like him, always 3 steps ahead, but never far enough to lose the trail completely. 2 days later, Marla stood before the rusted gates of an abandoned conservatory swallowed by vines and silence. The building looked like it hadn't breathed in years. But the piano music drifting from inside told her otherwise. "She steppet trug se door,
Gandraun.
The floorboards creaked beneath her boots as she moved deeper into the ruins. Sheet music fluttered in the breeze, blank pages nailed to walls, scattered across the floor like fallen leaves. At the center of the grand hall, a single spotlight beamed down from a broken ceiling onto a piano. A man was seated there, playing. She raised her gun.
Don't move.
He didn't flinch. The music didn't stop. I knew you'd come, he said softly, not turning to face her. You always wanted a proper ending, didn't you? Hands where I can see them now. You're too late, Detective Graves, he said, finally lifting his hands from the keys and turning slowly. But it wasn't him. It was someone else, a man wearing a latex mask molded in the composer's likeness. His hands trembled. Terror in his eyes. There's more. He stammered. He made me, he said if I didn't play, the others would die. Others? Marla asked sharply. He nodded toward the piano.
Undanis.
She moved quickly, pulling the bench away and prying open the floorboards beneath it. What she found chilled her more than the corpses ever could. Screens. Hundreds of live feeds. People, dozens of them, trapped in rooms. Isolated.
Sommerkrüing.
Some unconscious. Each one labeled with a musical term, adagio.
Crescendo. Fermata.
It wasn't over. It had only just begun. Marla stared at the screens, her breath catching in her throat. Each feed showed a different room, some sterile and white, others rusted and decayed like set pieces in a nightmare.
A child wept in one.
An old man pounded silently on glass in another. The composer had been collecting again, but this time, they were still alive. She tapped her earpiece. Daniels, patch in a trace on this signal. He's running a live network. We might be able to find the servers. Static.
Daniels? Come in.
More static. Then a voice, not his. Slow. Measured.
Familiar.
He can't hear you. No one can. Not from here. She spun around, gun raised, but the hall was empty. The screens began to shift, no longer showing the victims but her.
Different angles. From the cabin.
From her apartment. From the car. She'd been watched for weeks. No more masks, she growled into the silence. Face me.
A new monitor lit up. Lager. Brichter.
And there he was. The composer. Seated in a chamber of black glass, eyes calm, smile faint. Behind him, floor-to-ceiling shelves of tapes, photos, artifacts, memories, victims, trophies. You've always been my favorite, Marla. Her stomach turned.
Smart. Präzise.
A former artist, turned hunter. Your pain makes you pure. You're sick, she spat. You're like me, he said gently.
You just cause a different instrument.
She drew a shaky breath, lowering her weapon for a second. Why now?
Weshalb Silon expose alsis?
The composer leaned in.
Because the symphony ends when all instruments go silent.
And your silence will be the crescendo. The screens went black. Then the doors slammed shut behind her.
A sharp hiss filled the air. Gas.
She yanked her shirt up to cover her nose and lunged for the exit, but it was locked tight.
Hier Vision Blu-ray.
She stumbled toward the console, slamming buttons, but it was no use. The last thing she saw before collapsing was a final message flashing on the largest monitor. Movement 4, Resurrection. Hours later, Marla awoke. Strapped to a chair. In a room she didn't recognize. And across from her, someone else stirred.
Daniels.
Also bound. Bruised. Bleeding. He looked at her with panic. Marla, it's a trap. He's making us, he's. A speaker crackled.
Welcome to the final duet.
The room was dim, the walls soundproofed, sealed, and lined with mirrors, though Marla knew they were windows. Somewhere, he was watching. Studying. Conducting. Daniels struggled against his restraints. Blood trickled from a cut above his brow. He's playing with us. No, Marla said, her voice steady now. He's testing us. A screen flickered to life above them, and the composer appeared, only his silhouette visible, backlit in eerie red. His voice was calm-warm, as if he were welcoming friends.
This is your final composition, Detektive. 2 instruments.
One must fall silent for the other to leave. A metallic click echoed through the room.
2 objects rose slowly from the floor. 2 pistols, sealed in transparent glass cases, side by side. Ivy left you Aquase.
Just like I gave the others.
Kill, and be free.
Or wait, and both die. The audience is watching. Daniels looked at her, fear in his eyes. He's bluffing. Marla didn't answer. She stared at the guns, then up at the mirrors. No. He's never bluffed. Not once.
Silence.
Then softly, a familiar melody began to play through the speakers, the same haunting tune that had been echoing through every scene, every kill. The composer's requiem. But this time, she listened differently. The notes were staggered.
Out of SYNC.
Purposely flawed.
Maler narrowed her eyes.
He made a mistake.
Daniels blinked.
What? She scanned the room again, thinking like a composer.
Note a Detektive.
She traced the melody in her mind, matching each note to a beat, to a light flicker, to a hidden rhythm. Suddenly, she saw it, a pattern of lights in the mirrors. A code. A message.
A countdown.
She acted fast. Marla tipped the chair backward, smashing it hard against the floor. The leg broke, splintered off just enough to wedge between the case and its lock. She pried one open, grabbed the pistol. But instead of pointing it at Daniels, she pointed it straight at the camera. And fired.
Sparks flee.
The screen exploded. Then, the entire room shifted.
Gears behind the walls screeched. A door slammed open in the corner.
Go, she shouted to Daniels, tossing him the second gun and helping cut his bonds. Alarms blared. Steam hissed from the walls. The trap was collapsing. They ran.
Through dark corridors.
Past rooms filled with broken instruments, symbols scrawled in blood, victims' belongings catalogued like museum exhibits. Until, finally, they burst into the open.
The night hit them like a wave.
Flashlights. Shouting. SWAT teams surrounding the compound. They were safe. The composer's hideout had been destroyed in the chaos. His network exposed. Victims rescued. Some alive. Some not. But he was gone. Vanished. No prints.
No DNA. Only the recordings left behind.
But one piece lingered. A final tape, mailed directly to Marla's apartment.
She sat alone, playing it on an old cassette deck.
His voice, gentle as ever. Well done, maestro. You rewrote the ending. But even silence is just a pause in the music. She stared at the skyline through her window. Calm. Unblinking. Because she knew the truth.
The game was over.
But the composer was still out there. And the next movement would be hers.